You've all heard it. Make sure you can get this near my mouth so you can't hear it. There we go. You've all heard it. Every time new people come into this congregation or any Unitarian Universalist congregation I've been associated with, you hear similar comments that, like, I never knew a place like this existed. I never knew there was a place where I could think what I wanted to think, and people would affirm that it was very inclusive. Usually you hear their stories about their faith journeys, that they were raised something that somehow didn't agree with them anymore, and they couldn't clearly go to those places, and then found nothing else, and just stayed by themselves for a while, and then suddenly are surprised and show up here. And it's always very affirming, and it makes you feel good that you've been able to be part of an organization that has helped them out. But I started thinking about it. I never hear the, and then what? I mean, you guys actually have a great tradition of the spiritual journeys, and you come, people are selected that feel comfortable speaking in public, and usually do share some of that. And that's unique to hear. I don't have any other congregation I'm associated with that does that on such a regular basis, so kudos to you. But generally, I think it feels like it just stops. Although one of my favorite phrases when I tell people that are curious about what's Unitarian Universalism, I often say we're about the journey, not the destination, and supporting each other on the journey, but we never really talk about that. And as I was preparing for today's sermon, and the theme this month is journey, I tripped across some quotes about an exercise in mapping your religious road or your faith journey or your map, creating a map of where you've come. Because maybe if you've talked about where you've come from, it'll give you an indication of what's your next step. Where should you try next? What should you look at? Or perhaps you just assess it and go, you know what, I'm very proud of where I've come from and where I'm at the moment, and I'm comfortable to stay here. So today I thought I'd try to talk to you about it. And that sounded like a really great idea when I wrote the newsletter 2 months ago. And when I got to actually doing this, I'm like, well, what do you do? How do I map a religious road? I mean, I get the map that shows Interstate 41 and there's a red line between Fond du Lac and Appleton, and I know how to drive to the end of Johnson Street and get on it and get off at Prospect and get home. Okay, that kind of a map makes sense. It's something very tangible, very geographically based. But when you're talking about a faith journey map, what would that be? Now, if any of you know me very well at all, there's two things you probably have figured out. I'm very much a visual thinker, and I'm very much in tune with, like, feelings. It drives my brother and my wife crazy that they'll bring up these things that happened in the past, like 1997. Remember when we did this and we met with these people, we had this to eat, and la, 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 la. And I'm like, I have no clue. But if you told me that we were in a park, I would remember the way the sunlight and the shade played with each other through the leaves of the tree. I'd remember that, and I would remember the feeling that I felt at that moment. But I can't remember the details. So I thought, okay, if I'm going to do a religious road map, it has to probably have some visual aspect and something about feeling that ties to my belief statements at the time. So, not quite yet.
Okay.
Sorry, getting a little trigger happy. I got slides for you today. So I thought, well, I could stand up here and I could give you a bunch of visual images like you just saw with the video, and I could talk about my feelings. And I'm like, okay, that's a little too fluffy and out there for most of you. I think you need some sort of context or structure to put it into. So I immediately thought of James Fowler's Stages of Faith. Now, have any of you heard of this? If you're kind of in the psychology world, you've probably heard about it. Okay. About 20 years ago, the director of religious education up in Appleton did a sermon on James Fowler's Stages of Faith and how it worked with child development and adult development. And I found it fascinating and found that it really rang true for me. So I decided to put my little fluffy feelings and visual images into a framework of James Fowler's Stages of Faith. So let me tell you what this is all about. So what I'm using today actually comes from a website called psychologycharts.com. I want to give it credit and talk about a little bit about James Fowler. From Wikipedia, it's James W. Fowler III. He lived from 1940 and just died in 2015. He was an American theologian who was a professor of theology and human development at Emory University, and he was director of both the Center of Research on Faith and Moral Development and the Center for Ethics until he retired in 2005. And in addition to that, he was a minister in the United Methodist Church. So in 1981, James Fowler, created a book called The Stages of Faith. And when I said if you're kind of in the psychology world, it's because a lot of what he did was he leaned heavily into a lot of developmental psychology from Piaget, Kohlberg, and Erikson's stages. So there's 6 stages, and I will walk through them with you. And the one thing I want to caution you, this is not a hierarchy. The last thing I want is you to leave today like all puffed up because you're at stage 5 and you know so-and-so's only at stage 3 and you're better than them. That's not what this is about. And I've thought of examples. This is about your faith journey. And often your faith journey reflects your life, duh. And so it has to do with where you're at and what you need your faith to deliver. And sometimes some more of the more earlier stages of faith development make sense to that person, and they're very comfortable with that, and that's okay. So I wanted to make sure that that was a takeaway before I got into this. Now, Sylvia, how about the next stage? So the first one, the names are not, they're kind of like cryptic, so bear with me. I'll give you descriptions that were written on the website. The first stage is intuitive projective. This is the stage of preschool children in which fantasy and reality often get mixed together. However, during this stage, our most basic ideas about God are usually picked up from our parents and or society. And that was absolutely true for me. I wrote down there that I had a belief in parents, God, religion, it all went together in my world. My mother and her sister, whom I will talk about at one point, were very raised in fundamentalist Lutheranism and very much embraced it, loved it. I was born when my mother was 40, and so she had 20 years of being a Sunday school teacher, and so she created Sunday school every day in my home. So whatever the seasons of the church were, we had decorations up for that season. So to me, it all morphed together. My home was just some elaborate Sunday school room. When I went to our little country church, it was the same thing. I saw it there. But I got a very warm feeling. I was very much loved with both the church family and my parents. And so my visual was like being wrapped up in a warm blanket, and then I found this heart quilt, which I just thought made it perfect. So, as a toddler, up until probably age 5, that's how this all went together. And it was wonderful. Stage 2 is the mythic literal. This one, it says, when children become school age, they start understanding the world in more logical ways. They generally accept the stories told to them by their faith community, but tend to understand them in very literal ways, and then a few people remain in this stage throughout adulthood. And I would say that my mother and her sister pretty much remain in this stage, or maybe crossed a little bit into the next stage, throughout their whole adulthood. And I didn't know what to make of that until I did the eulogy for my aunt about 10 years ago, and I got more of the details straight of their life. And these were 2 girls who were 5 and 7 when their father died of pneumonia back in the late 1920s. They had no health insurance, and it launched them into poverty. Then the Great Depression hit, and so I think there was a lot of PTSD going on in this family, and their mother always, it wasn't mentioned, but I think she pretty much had some severe mental health issues. So I just think for them to have a faith that was very grounded in black and white and what they could believe in really made sense for them, and it was great and supported them through their life. But for me, it was all about, I love that Bible and those really stylized pictures in the Bible, like this one, the Garden of Eden. This was my first introduction to nakedness, of course. And I love that there's this little head of Satan up in the tree, and the snake's tail is around the tree, and they're doing the apple, of course, the story of the apple. And so all of my beliefs were like that I literally took all the stories as true. I think I had a belief in magic. At the time, I just thought the world was magical, God was out there taking care of everything, and I was just in awe of it. In fact, as I was preparing for this, we lived way out in the country. This is from when I was 6 to 11. We were the very last bus stop in rural Illinois. There was cornfields as far as the eye could see, except for our land, which was just grass and trees, and a forest behind me that went to the Rock River. And I swear, no one would do this today, but when I was 7, I think I walked up our long driveway and stood by the highway waiting for the bus to come. And it was a day like this week where there's snow everywhere, and maybe we weren't plowed out yet, so I had to walk to the end and wait for the bus. And I was freezing, but it was a clear blue sky and sunshine, and I just, you know me, I started singing at the top of my lungs, "Oh, what a beautiful morning," because I just thought God was out there, and I had to talk to God and sing to God in the blue sky, and it just made me happy. So it was just this time of awe and belief in magic. So that was stage 2. Stage 3, this is the synthetic conventional. The description is most people move on to this stage as teenagers. At this point, their life has grown to include several different social circles, and there is a need to pull it all together. When this happens, a person usually adopts some sort of all-encompassing belief system. However, at this stage, people tend to have a hard time seeing outside their box, and they don't recognize that they are inside a belief system. At this stage, authority is usually placed in individuals or groups that represent one's belief. And then there's a comment that this is the stage in which many people remain. And I think that's where we get the stories of the incomers here. And they leave congregations where people felt very comfortable in that box and they didn't want the world to change. And so our folks tend to feel like, okay, that's not working so well for me, and that you'll hear about that in the next stage, and then they leave and then eventually find their way here. But for me, and this was a teenager time, when I was 12 to 18, I thought of life as this chess game. And I had a belief in order, that the entire universe was designed in very black and white structure, black and white order, and it was driven by fear. Because you got to remember, I was growing up at one of the more tumultuous times of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, and there was a lot of talk about when are we going to get nuked, and we knew where the nuke bomb shelters were. And then those of you that are old enough probably remember the horror movie craze that happened in the 70s, and The Exorcist, and I was too young to get into the movies, but back then nobody cared, so we snuck in anyway. So I had all of this going in my head. So this was how I envisioned the universe, that I was that black little pawn between God and Satan, and it was just between the powers of the two. And at that point, I know some people have always mentioned a real love of Jesus and of God, and I never really had that. I kind of saw them as the white knight in shining armor, but I didn't have a lot of love for it. I just had a fear of the devil and all of that. And so that's what was kind of ruling my life, and I kind of assumed that if you followed all these rules and checked these boxes, that I would make it, and I'd show up at the pearly gates with this list, and I'd get in. But one night, and this is kind of the culmination of this, I was probably closer to the 17, 18, maybe a little younger than that. I woke up in the middle of the night just terrified and just sweating, and I was convinced that Satan or the devil was in my room. And I thought, well, what am I going to do about this? Because I knew how to get rid of vampires, of course, with a cross and garlic, but I didn't know anything about Satan. And so all I could do was recite the Lord's Prayer. And those of you that don't come from a Christian background, it's a prayer that is attributed to Jesus that's in the Gospels. And I just repeated it over and over and over again until I kind of calmed myself down and went back to bed. But that was, to me, an indicator of how raw my emotions were in a belief in this order of things and this fear that was going to take me over. So that's my mapping of that particular point in my life. So then stage 4 is the individuative, I had to practice saying that, individuative reflective stage. This is the tough stage, often begun in young adulthood, when people start seeing outside the box and realizing that there are other boxes. They begin to critically examine their beliefs on their own and often become disillusioned with their former faith. Ironically, the stage 3 people usually think that stage 4 people have become backsliders, when in reality they've actually moved forward. Now they're using some language here about forward, backwards, but I think as come-inners, which most Unitarian Universalists in this congregation are, I think we know that story. We probably moved into stage 4 at some points in our life, and the people we left behind were in stage 3, and they didn't think too highly of us, and some of that's probably never been resolved. Well, at this point, This was my college years, 18 to 23. I was a 5-year student. That image was exactly how I felt. I had lost my moorings. Well, let me tell you the story. My freshman year, I went to a Lutheran college. So I went to a Lutheran high school. So I was all about Lutheranism. I never even applied anywhere else except Lutheran colleges. So I thought I was safe in my little bubble, that my faith was going to never be shaken. And I signed up for this class mostly because I thought it was a great way to get extra credits faster. Was co-taught by a very liberal Lutheran minister and an English professor. And the class met every day, and we all lived in the same dorm and met in the lounge to discuss it, to take the class and discuss it. And it was all about religious themes reflected in literature and back and forth. And after about a month or two, it dawned on me that we were treating the Bible as a work of literature instead of the inerrant Word of God, which totally flipped me out. I lost the entire foundation of how I was brought up. Didn't know what to do with that, felt I'd been lied to, wanted to shuck the whole thing out the window, and then for about 4 years hovered somewhere between atheist, agnostic, angry, whatever, and this is how I felt. On this little boat, little raft, floating out at sea with these storm clouds and lightning in the distance, felt very anxious, very disbelief. Fortunately, a lot of my friends were going through the same thing, so it was kind of cool to be a non-believer at the time, but that wasn't a lot of help. And so I had rejected my fundamentalism of my youth, but I hadn't replaced it with anything else. But the weird thing was, I was a member of that choir you just heard, the St. Olaf Chapel Choir, and we sang in chapel at least once a month, and went on a little tour around Minnesota. And I love music, and I love choral music, and I love that song. And so here I am participating in all these services and singing all these words that I don't believe at all, but I couldn't rip myself away from it. So I was kind of say I was in love with the smells and bells of Lutheranism, but not the theology and the doctrine of it. Well, I was fortunate enough. I was a German and economics major in my first senior year, my 4th year. I lived in Germany to work on that German major, which of course is not a very good major. I never use it. But anyway, lived in Germany and did a lot of traveling behind the Iron Curtain at the time because I was fascinated with their economic systems. I found myself on Good Friday in Prague, and it was pouring buckets, and I was freezing, and I needed to get warm, so I went into a church and sat in the back pew. There was a Good Friday service going on in some language I didn't understand, and I didn't care. But I got warm, and I took out my journal, and it was the first time I really came to a point where I realized I needed religion in my life. I wanted there to be a God, even if I didn't believe in God. I just needed that in my life. And so from that point on, I decided to intentionally figure out what to do about that. So, so then I came back to the United States, which then leads to stage 5. So I moved back to Northfield, Minnesota. I only went to school part-time and worked almost full-time, and I was living with a buddy that was from the town and belonged to a very, very liberal congregational church. And in my case, the way I entered churches is I joined the choir, because everybody always needs tenors, and so you immediately have a group of friends. And so I was singing in the choir, and on Easter Sunday, it struck me, because I was raised in a faith that even though it was Easter Sunday and they were singing all these songs of joy, nobody looked very joyful. It was very somber, like something you had to do. And I don't remember exactly what it looked like, but there was this woman with this crazy Easter bonnet on it, kind of like this one. And they had some interpretive dance group from the professor at the college, and I'm like, my God, these people are actually happy on Easter. This is amazing. And it just brought me a lot of hope. And then this was the first church, too, where they had some social justice going on. You could go out in the lobby, and they had a table for Amnesty International, and you could sign letters. And I'm like, well, what I grew up is that church is just about the next life. It has nothing to do with this life, and we should never talk about this life at all, because it's all about getting your card punched for the next life. So I was blown away. And I just thought, so it taught me this whole entry, that was the entryway, that Easter Sunday, into sort of these feelings of hope and not taking life quite so seriously. And it started me on a road towards religion grounded in love and inclusiveness. Now this has lasted for 35 years. This started when I was 23, and I'm now about to turn 58. And I'm still at this stage. And I've struggled with my own levels of dogmatism and intolerance. So when I moved to Minneapolis, I joined this really liberal congregational church downtown Minneapolis, the big music church, of course. And so I began to look down on everybody who wasn't liberal Christian, that they were just ignorant or something like that. And then, of course, when I moved to Appleton 25 years ago, joined the Unitarian Universalist Church and ended up becoming more religious humanist, I, of course, looked down on everybody who wasn't religious humanist. So I was doing what I shouldn't be doing anyway, but just with a different lens. And so it wasn't until seminary that it finally opened up my world into a belief in metaphor. That metaphor is religion. No one can prove anything one way or another about religion, and so it's all about story. It's all about metaphor, and it's all right. You and I can have completely different journeys, completely different paths, believe in completely different metaphors, and that's okay as long as you're not forcing me to believe in your metaphor and I'm not supposed to believe in, or vice versa. So that was where I am still at in stage 5, but stage 6 is where I think I want to go. And the description there is, few people reach this stage. Those who do live their lives in full service of others without real worries or doubts. I doubt that I will ever achieve that, but it dawned on me that as a minister, people often look to me for this thing called, well, what is it like to be holy? Like I'm supposed to have some hotline to God or something, and I don't feel like I have that, right? And so a lot of my peers from seminary do a lot of spiritual work that I don't do. And it's been recommended to me that I get a spiritual director. And the spiritual director, from what I can tell, comes out of Catholicism, and it is about lining up your life, how you live your life and your values with the idea of becoming more holy. So it is something I'm going to go work on and recruit. I don't know how they're going to deal with me, but we'll see how that works out. But it's really turning into, I hope, a belief in this spiritual connection. And for me, it's dawned on me that my journey has not been linear. It's actually been sort of a circle, because I've come full circle back to where I started with a feeling of warmth in the way my belief was unfolding with this spiritual connection that I haven't really had for a long time. It's been much more up in my head than down in my heart. So I'm looking forward to stepping into this next stage to see where it goes. So for me, to close all of this, I want to say that the visual images and the feelings that I get from that E.E. Cummings poem are really speaking to me in this space. The interconnectedness of nature, of metaphors of the divine, and my own connectedness. And the more I thought about it, it's probably a little bit more sophisticated song than Oh What a Beautiful Morning that I had back when I was 7 years old, but here I am at 57, kind of drawn to the same kind of things. So to close, I'm going to read that poem to you one last time. I thank you, God, for most this amazing day, for the leaping, greely spirits of trees, and the blue, true dream of sky, and for everything which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. I who have died am alive again today, and this is the sun's birthday. This is the birthday of life, and of love, and of wings, and of the gay, great, happening, illimitably earth. How should tasting, touching, hearing, seeing, breathing, any, lifted from the no of all nothing, human merely being doubt in unimaginable you? Now the ears of my ears awake, and now the eyes of my eyes are opened. Amen.
Amen.